Howdy, partner. Before we start, I want you to choose a favorite. If you are like me, you might struggle choosing a favorite, simply because you love all of them for a different reason. Demon Souls has a fantastic atmosphere I always find myself going back to. Dark Souls 1 has some of the best world design I've ever played through, minus Lost Isolate. Dark Souls 3 has a phenomenal boss roster all the way through. Bloodborne has the coolest and most unique weapons. Elden Ring is just a lot of fun overall. And Dark Souls 2? Well, Dark Souls 2 is just Dark Souls 2. Beyond all of these good things, most of them are unfortunately plagued by one issue that I think has only gotten worse over the years. And that would be equipment farming. Now, I know that this might ruffle some feathers, but hear me out. I think that farming in general is okay. The kind of farming most people tend to engage in is farming for resources that make your character stronger. I think everyone has done that at least once, and I mean, it's easy to see why. Are you having trouble with a certain encounter? Just farm for a bit, get stronger, and you don't have to worry about being underpowered for a while. This also applies to Souls games to the point where we even have the term overleveled, which is achieved by having farmed a bunch of enemies over and over before attempting to fight a major boss. Some people might say that this makes the experience worse, because you will end up essentially cheating your way out of a boss that was meant to be fought at a certain power level. I can understand why people might feel that way, but I personally disagree. I feel like this is part of the beauty of these games. Discovering your own way of overcoming an obstacle, even if that means becoming stronger than the obstacle itself. In short, farming for things like player power is great. The farming that is not so great, as previously mentioned, is the farming for equipment, which is something that got worse with every single new release in the Souls series. To understand why farming for equipment is unpleasant, we first have to understand why having certain pieces of equipment is pleasant in the first place. There are obviously multiple reasons, but I want to start off by what I believe to be the least important, and work my way up to the most important reason. Let us begin. At a surface level, let's be honest, everybody likes fashion. I think every single one of us here did at least one run with a weapon that looked cool, but wasn't exactly overpowered or anything like that. I think a golden example to this would be something like the Warhawk's Talon, or any of the noble swords. Not saying that they are bad or anything, I just think that there are infinitely better options out there. But people still go and farm for them because they just look cool, and people want to have them, or in some cases they even want to use them. You could also just say that there are people who want to complete the game and have every single item in the game, although that is such a small minority that I didn't even want to go more in depth about this in specific. Beyond this, though, let's talk about a much larger section of people, the ones who replay the game again and again. To me personally, one of the best things about Souls games is just how replayable they are. Starting a playthrough with a weapon you haven't used before will allow you to not only better learn the game, but also give you a fresh experience. Obviously, the bosses don't change at all, but the way you approach not only them but also the game as a whole does vary from weapon to weapon. Now obviously you are always going to have staples and certain routines that you might want to do for a character regardless of weapon. Like, let's say in the early game you will almost always grab Radogon's Sword Seal. Or, if you are like me, you might want to use Bloodhound's Fang for a little bit. That said, the experience of learning how to properly use a new weapon, something that has a different moveset, abilities, and timings, is something that I find to be extremely rewarding. Even more so than playing through the game the first time around. And so guess what happens when you want to use a certain weapon, only to find out it's only available from a certain enemy with, let's say, a 2% drop rate. You aren't gonna be very pleased, are you? It's just part of the reason why I dislike farming, but anyway, let's keep going on. Moving on to the most important part. And it's just that people love playing and utilizing strong pieces of equipment. And again, I ask you the question, guess what happens when you make an amazing weapon that people want to get and people want to use, be available only from a drop rate? Nobody's going to like that. People are gonna farm for it regardless, but nobody's gonna have a good time. And if anything, in some cases, a farm can be so atrocious that it can simply worsen the overall experience with the game. And so imagine what happens when you take two of the best spells in the game and make them only available from a long and arduous farm. Hold on a second, we don't have to imagine that. Why? Because we have Dark Souls 3. Look, I'm gonna rip the band-aid off. Everybody knows that in a couple of years, the online servers of this game are gonna get shut down. Which means that the only way to obtain the Darkmoon Sunlight is by farming the Silver Knights. Again. And again. And again. And again. We all love making jokes about Dark Souls 2, but we gotta admit, that game did a wonderful job balancing the Covenant rewards and the way you obtain them. At least some of them, you still have to farm for the Sunlight Medal, but anyway. You can either just do the Covenant activities, or if you get the New Game Plus too, you can just buy everything from a merchant. Sure, it would be nicer if you could buy all this stuff right away, but I am not gonna complain about it too much because it's still better than what we have in Dark Souls 3. With regards to Elden Ring, there aren't any covenants or rewards tied to them, but instead we still have a bunch of weapons that are only available from farming. I am willing to bet everyone tried farming for the Magma Blade, at least once. Getting that thing took hours upon hours for me, and I know for a fact I am not alone in this. And that is just one weapon. Now imagine if you wanted to get something else too, like let's say the Unmoist Longhorn. To be fair, you might never want this again, but you know, for argument's sake, let's pretend you actually want it. You are gonna be looking at another half an hour or so just wasted on trying to get this piece of equipment. Look, I completely understand why farming exists in an online game, like an MMO. Let's be honest, it's a live service game, engagement metrics are important, and the more time you spend in the game, the more likely you are to purchase something, right? It makes sense why certain things would have an incredibly low drop rate. But in a single player game, why? What is the point? Nobody likes to farm for hours on end, so why keep it in the game? Bloodborne doesn't have this problem because everything relevant in the game is a guaranteed drop. You want a certain weapon? Awesome! Just go kill something, get their badge, and now you have the option to buy whatever you are looking for. And so you might be wondering, why should you farm in Bloodborne if all the necessary stuff is obtainable without farming? Well, as mentioned at the very beginning, you can farm for player power, in the form of level ups, or you can also farm for blood vials, which function as your healing item, and silver bullets, which is a consumable required for certain weapons. Besides that, you can also spend this currency to buy other things like upgrade materials or other consumables like buff items. And let me just say that this system feels a lot more balanced. Don't get me wrong, I still think that the flask system is better than the blood vial system. But I would be lying if I said I didn't enjoy Bloodborne more, on the pure basis that if I want to play with a certain build or weapon, I know exactly when I will have said thing with no farming to waste my time. If I had to choose between farming for weapons and farming for healing items, I honestly think I would rather choose the healing items. It just seems like a much better option in the long term. Does anybody else remember trying to do a dexterity build in Dark Souls 1? So you go to the Undead Parish, and you want to farm for the Baldur's Sword, and you spend like an hour there, and you're not getting anything, so you say screw it, and you just do another run with the Zweihander instead. I think that is all too common honestly, and kind of upsets me, you know? Before I wrap up, I should also mention that Demon's Souls doesn't really have this problem either. You are out of luck if we are talking about upgraded materials though. Pure Blade Stone Shard, anyone? At the end of the day, do I understand why some people like to farm for stuff? Sure, I get it. The dopamine you receive from finally obtaining something you have been after for a long time is not something to scoff at. But at the same time, I much prefer just getting what I want, with no farming required to slow me down. Let me get my dopamine by just playing the game, you know. But anyway, that is just what I think, and it goes without saying everyone is free to disagree with me. I kind of just wanted to have an excuse to talk about the one thing I love about Bloodborne. That's all. But anyway, I hope you had a good time watching this regardless, and I hope you will have some nice days ahead of you. Thank you for having watched this, and I will see you again soon. Take care, everybody.
You may rest here too, if you like.